Welcome back, fam. I'm Wyatt Paints, and I've got an educational video for you today. This is going to be part 3 of our resin tips and tricks guide. Today's focus is going to be filling seams, gaps, and other surface issues. Hopefully in this video, you'll find a couple of tricks that'll take your project to the next level. Let's get started. First, let's talk about one of the most common issues in resin printing, support marks. These are caused with the removal of heavier supports. Let's take a closer look at the cross-section of this issue to get a better idea how it can be fixed. As you can see here, support marks will have these raised areas surrounding a small pit that is dug into the part. You can solve this with sanding, but you'll need to sand down to the bottom of the pit, which will take a long time. Here is an example on the back of a splinter. Sanding this would take a long time, and I run the risk of sanding off some of the details I want to keep. To fix this, I use Tamiya Basic Putty. But first, a word of warning. When using this product, you will want to protect your work surface, wear gloves, and work in a well-ventilated space. This stuff has some very strong odors, similar to model cement. Also, while this stuff does take about an hour to cure, it does start stiffening up pretty fast, so only take a little bit at a time and get more as you need it. After dabbing some on a piece of foil, I use my gloved finger to smear a thin layer on all over the marks, making sure each gets filled. Like I said, you'll need to give this about an hour to cure. A good sign that it's cured is that it no longer has a strong smell, but if you want to be safe, 2 hours and you should be golden. Once cured, I go over all the putty areas with a 400 to 600 grit sandpaper. When you do this, be sure you're prepared to deal with the dust. You do not want to breathe this in, so wear a respirator. Now, when I do this, I'm looking for many small circles to appear. This lets me know that I've sanded down the high ridges of all those marks and that they're now flush with the surrounding areas. Then, I make sure to go and sand around the perimeter of wherever I put the putty in order to taper down the edges. At this point, I would call this part ready for priming. Doing so will allow me to better see if I need to go back and do some more sanding. But looking at this, it looks good for me. Next are seams that I split into 2 groups that I handled differently: hairline seams and gaps. Hairline seams are when your parts come together very tight with no space, but you can still see the seam. If you go ahead and just paint over this, it absolutely will be visible, and any washes used will create a hard line along it. To address this, I use plastic putty from Vallejo. This is a marble dust water-based putty, so it's safe to use with your bare hands and can be thinned and cleaned with just water. The needle tip allows you to apply this accurately along the seam without too much excess. Personally, I find it best to work in small sections at a time. First, I lay down a bead of seam, and then I wipe over it with my finger or a silicone sculpting tool. Now, in my experience, this stuff does not sand well, so don't leave any more on than you need. It'll take about an hour or 2 to dry, and once dry, you can prime as usual to check to ensure that your seam is gone. This can also be used to fill small holes that can happen if there are air bubbles caught in the resin. A small dab and a wipe with your finger or tool will do the job. Finally, we have what I would call a gap. These are pretty common if you have a slight bit of warping in your print. You would not want to use plastic putty here because it shrinks when it dries, so the line will still be visible. And the Tamiya Putty also doesn't really bridge gaps well. Instead, I use a MilliPut. This is a 2-part epoxy that'll harden to something similar to clay and can be sanded smooth. Just like with the Tamiya Putty, you want to use gloves when working with this, but thankfully, it does not smell. After mixing equal parts, I tend to make thin snakes of putty and lay them down into the gap. At this point, I use a dental tool to really work it into the gap so there's only a little bit of overspill. This putty will take 3 to 4 hours to cure, so you have plenty of time to adjust it until you're happy with the placement. Once it is cured, I then put a thin coat of Tamiya Putty over it. After that dries, I sand it smooth. And here's the final result of the sanding. Now it's time to go ahead and prime this and make sure that our seam is completely invisible. There, it looks great. Hopefully this video has given you some helpful advice on how to address these common issues with your resin prints. If there is a particular issue that you face and you'd like to know how I handle it, feel free to leave a comment down below and I'll try to adjust it, or even better, maybe I'll make a video on it in the future. But until next time, thank you for watching, keep creating, always enjoy the process.